It was a cloudy morning in Washington, D.C., and the courthouse buzzed with its usual weekday noise. Lawyers hurried down the hallways carrying piles of files. People whispered nervously about their cases, and the sound of footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Inside one of the courtrooms, a retired soldier stood quietly near the front, waiting for his turn to speak. His name was Michael Harris, though most people who knew him simply called him the guard. Michael wasn't an ordinary veteran. For several years, he had served as a tomb guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery, one of the highest honors in the U.S. military. Every minute of his service had been about silence, respect, and discipline. He had stood through rainstorms, snow, heat, and thunder, guarding the resting place of soldiers whose names were lost to history. Even now, though retired, his posture was perfect, his shoes polished, his shirt neatly ironed. But that morning he wasn't in court because of anything heroic. It was something small as a parking violation. A ticket had been issued near the Veterans Memorial, and Michael had come to contest it. For most people, this kind of case wouldn't mean much, but for him it was about principle. He believed he hadn't done anything wrong, and he wanted to explain his side. When his name was called, Michael walked to the front of the courtroom. He didn't rush or shuffle. He walked with the same calm and steady steps he had learned as a guard. The judge, Judge Patterson, a middle-aged man with silver hair and reading glasses, looked up from his papers. He didn't seem interested in the case. To him, it was just another name on a long list of minor cases that morning. "Mr. Harris," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "you're here about a parking ticket issued near the War Memorial last month. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Michael replied politely. His voice was deep and steady, carrying just enough strength to be heard clearly. Before Michael could say more, the judge leaned back and smiled faintly. "A veteran, huh? Tomb guard, it says here," he said, glancing at the file. Then with a half-smirk, he added, "You used to guard an empty grave, didn't you? I always wondered what the point of that was." The courtroom went quiet. A few people looked at the judge in surprise. Others stared at Michael to see how he would react. But Michael didn't move. His expression didn't change at all. He simply stood straight, hands behind his back, eyes calm. The judge seemed amused by his silence. "No offense," he continued, chuckling softly, "but guarding a tomb that doesn't even have a name on it seems like a strange use of manpower, don't you think? Especially when it's raining or snowing. You could have just stayed home." Still, Michael said nothing. The judge tapped his pen against the desk, waiting for a reaction that never came. The veteran's stillness began to feel almost powerful, though the judge didn't realize it yet. "All right then," Judge Patterson said after a pause. "Go ahead, Mr. Harris, tell us your side." Michael nodded once and began to speak. "Your Honor, I received the ticket while attending a small memorial event at the cemetery. There were no clear parking signs at that time. I only stayed for 15 minutes to lay flowers for a friend who never made it back home." His tone remained respectful, not defensive. Every word was slow and measured. The courtroom listened quietly. The judge scribbled something on his paper, not looking up. "So you're saying you parked illegally because of emotion, not ignorance," he said, half smiling again. Michael's eyes didn't waver. "No, Your Honor. I'm saying I parked where I believed it was allowed. I was wrong, perhaps, but not careless." The firmness in his voice made the judge glance up. There was no anger in Michael's tone. No pride either, just quiet confidence. "Well," the judge said, shrugging, "I guess all those years of standing still must have taught you patience." This time, a few people chuckled softly in the courtroom. Michael didn't join them. Instead, he looked directly at the judge and replied calmly, "Standing still, Your Honor, was never about patience. It was about respect." The room grew silent again. Something in his voice, and maybe the weight of memory, maybe the calm dignity, made people stop moving. Even the judge leaned forward a little. Michael continued, "Every soldier buried there gave up his name, his future, and his family for the rest of us. The tomb of the unknown soldier is not empty. It holds the remains of men who never came home. My duty was to make sure they were never forgotten." The judge's smile faded. He adjusted his glasses again, but didn't interrupt. "I stood in rain and snow and thunder," Michael said quietly. "Sometimes we stood for hours in the middle of storms. But we never left our post, not once. Because the men we stood for never left theirs. That's what the tomb means." There was no pride in his tone, only sincerity. Each word felt like a memory carved into his heart. The bailiff, who had been leaning on the wall, now stood upright. A woman sitting in the back row wiped her eyes. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to fade. For a moment, the judge didn't know what to say. He cleared his throat and tried to regain his formal tone. "Well, Mr. Harris," he said slowly, "that's admirable. But we're here about a parking violation, not military tradition." Michael nodded once again. "Of course, Your Honor. I understand." The judge looked down at his notes, clearly uncomfortable. The confidence he had shown earlier seemed to shrink. Something about the soldier's calmness made his earlier jokes feel small and disrespectful. "Do you have proof that the signs weren't visible?" the judge asked finally. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. He took out a small envelope, pulled out photos showing how the parking area looked that day, and handed them to the bailiff. The judge examined them carefully, nodding slowly. After a long pause, the judge said softly, "I see your point." The signs were poorly placed. Michael didn't smile or relax. He simply said, "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge looked up again, his tone different now. "Mr. Harris," he said, I didn't mean any disrespect earlier. I was only making conversation." Michael looked at him quietly for a moment and then gave a small nod. "Respect is earned, sir, and I believe everyone deserves it, even those we don't know by name." The words hung in the air. The judge opened his mouth but didn't respond. Something about that single sentence struck deep. The courtroom was completely silent as the judge signed the dismissal paper. "The ticket is canceled," he said at last. "You're free to go." Michael nodded once again, thanked the judge politely, and turned to leave. As he walked out of the courtroom, everyone watched in silence. No one clapped or whispered. They simply watched the quiet man in uniform stride out with the same grace he had carried his entire life. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. The clouds that had hung heavy in the morning slowly drifted apart, letting a few rays of sunlight touch the courthouse steps. Michael stopped for a moment and looked up. He took a slow breath and smiled faintly, not for victory, but for peace. Inside, the judge remained seated, staring at the empty doorway. For the first time in years, he felt small in his own courtroom. His joke, once funny in his mind, now sounded cruel. He whispered softly to himself, "Guarding honor. That's what he does." That day, something in the judge quietly changed, and though no one said it out loud, everyone who had sat in that courtroom left with the same thought. That respect, once lost, can always be regained through humility. The next day, the story of the courtroom moment quietly spread through the courthouse. Clerks whispered about it during lunch. Lawyers mentioned it in the hallways, and even a few visitors had heard how a judge had mocked a veteran only to be answered with quiet dignity. But for Michael Harris, it was just another day. He didn't think of himself as a hero or a man who had taught a judge a lesson. He simply believed he had done what was right, stood for respect, and walked away with peace. That morning, he sat in a small cafe near Arlington Cemetery, sipping his coffee as he watched people pass by. His uniform jacket hung neatly beside him, pressed and spotless as always. He carried himself with the same quiet discipline he had learned long ago. The world moved fast around him, phones ringing, people rushing, cars honking, but he remained still, calm, and grounded. As he looked out the window, he noticed a group of young soldiers in casual uniform walking by, laughing and talking. They reminded him of his younger days when he first joined the army. Back then, he was full of energy and dreams, but also unsure about what kind of man he wanted to become. Everything changed the first day he stood before the tomb of the unknown soldier. Michael's mind drifted back to that moment. He could almost hear the faint rustle of the trees and the echo of his own footsteps on the marble walkway. The silence around the tomb was not empty, it was powerful. Every step had to be perfect, every turn sharp, every second counted. For many people, it looked like a simple guard duty. But for those who served, it was sacred. He remembered how, on his first day, an older guard had told him, "Son, when you walk here, you're not just guarding a tomb. You're guarding the promise that America never forgets her fallen." Those words stayed with him forever. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend, Sergeant Paul Bennett, who had also served as a tomb guard years ago. "Hey, Mike," the message read. "Heard what happened in court yesterday. You handled it with class. The boys are proud of you." Michael smiled faintly. He hadn't realized that word had spread that far. He typed back, "Didn't do anything special. Just spoke the truth." Paul's reply came almost instantly. That's what makes it special. Michael put the phone away and looked back outside. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the flags that lined the street. He took another sip of coffee and thought about how times had changed. The younger generation sometimes didn't understand the old ways, the silent respect, the discipline, the code. But he didn't blame them. Respect, he believed, wasn't taught through words. It was learned through example. Later that afternoon, Michael decided to take a walk through Arlington. He often went there, not just to remember, but to feel connected to the men and women he once guarded. The cemetery was peaceful that day. The grass was freshly cut, and the white headstones stretched endlessly across the hills like rows of quiet soldiers. As he approached the tomb, he saw a young guard standing watch. The guard's movements were perfect, every step measured, every turn exact. The sight made Michael's chest tighten with pride. He stood quietly at a distance, watching the ritual he once performed thousands of times. A few tourists nearby whispered to one another, snapping photos. Some of them talked loudly, unaware of the solemnity of the place, but when the guard turned sharply and tapped his rifle, the sound was enough to silence them. It was the kind of silence that carried respect without needing a single word. Michael stood there for a long time, his hands folded in front of him. Then, unexpectedly, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir," said a young woman holding a notepad. "Are you Mr. Harris, the retired guard?" He turned slowly, surprised. "Yes," he replied politely. She smiled nervously. "I'm a reporter from the local paper. I heard about what happened in court yesterday. Would you be willing to share your story?" Michael shook his head gently. "There's not much to tell. A misunderstanding, that's all." "But people are saying it was powerful," she insisted, "that your words changed the judge's view about veterans." Michael looked past her toward the tomb again. "Miss, it's not about changing anyone's view. It's about reminding people why we serve." The reporter hesitated, then asked softly, "And why do you think you serve?" He smiled faintly. "Because some gave up everything. The least we can do is give them our time." She didn't know what to say. There was something in his calmness that made even simple words feel deep. She thanked him and walked away quietly, her notepad still blank. That evening, as the sun began to set, Michael sat on a bench overlooking the cemetery. The sky was painted with soft shades of gold and pink, and the air was still. He thought about his life, how much he had seen, how many brothers he had lost, and how much the world had changed. He also thought about the judge. He didn't hate the man. In truth, he felt sorry for him, not out of pity, but because the judge had never experienced what it meant to stand for something bigger than himself. Michael hoped that their brief meeting had opened his eyes even a little. Back in the courtroom that same day, Judge Patterson sat alone in his office. He had been thinking about Michael ever since he left. The words "we guard honor" kept repeating in his mind. He had spent most of his career believing that power came from the bench, from the authority of his position. But now he realized that true power came from quiet strength, the kind he saw in that veteran's eyes. He looked out the window, lost in thought. For years he had seen veterans come and go in his courtroom, often impatient, sometimes bitter. But Michael was different. There was no anger in him, no pride, no need to prove anything, just grace. The judge took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I mocked a man who guards the memory of heroes," he whispered to himself. The thought stung. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He had been wrong before in his life, but never had it bothered him like this. For the next few days, the image of Michael's calm face wouldn't leave his mind. During breaks, he found himself searching online about the tomb of the unknown soldier, watching videos of the guards marching in perfect silence. The more he learned, the more respect he felt. He discovered that tomb guards trained for months, memorizing thousands of rules, learning to move with precision even under pressure. They polish their shoes and weapons until they shine like mirrors. They walk exactly 21 steps, pause for 21 seconds, turn and repeat, a number symbolizing the highest military honor. And through all of it, they never speak. They never break their bearing. They stand for those who cannot. Reading all this made the judge's chest tighten. "I mocked that," he murmured, "and he still showed me respect." That night, Judge Patterson sat at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. He thought about calling Michael to apologize, but he wasn't sure how. What could he possibly say that would match the quiet strength of that man's dignity? Meanwhile, Michael returned home and placed his uniform carefully in the closet. Before turning off the light, he looked at the metal pinned neatly on the inside pocket, a small silver badge with crossed rifles. He smiled softly. To him, it wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about doing something that mattered, even when no one was watching. As the city lights glowed outside his window, Michael whispered to himself, "We guard, so they are never forgotten." The following week, a soft rain fell over Washington, D.C., painting the streets in silver. In the quiet of his home office, Judge Patterson sat at his desk, still haunted by the words of Michael Harris. "We guard honor." The phrase had carved itself deep into his thoughts, replaying at odd moments while he read case files during meals. Even as he drifted off to sleep, he had seen many people in his courtroom angry, desperate, proud, but none had carried the calm dignity of that retired guard. Michael's silence that day had spoken louder than any argument, louder than any lawyer's speech. It was not a silence of weakness. It was a silence filled with strength. The judge now understood that. That morning, as he looked out the window at the falling rain, something inside him shifted. He realized that an apology was not enough. He needed to understand more about the tomb, the soldiers, and the people who served there. By noon, he made a decision. He took off his robe, hung it carefully, and left the courthouse quietly. His clerk, surprised, called after him, "Sir, are you taking the afternoon off?" "Yes," the judge replied with a faint smile. "I have something important to learn." Later that afternoon, the judge drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The rain had slowed to a drizzle and mist hung low between the white rows of headstones. The air smelled of wet grass and quiet reverence. As he walked up the hill toward the tomb of the unknown soldier, he felt smaller with each step. When he reached the marble platform, he stopped. There, before him, a lone guard marched in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, turn, pause, 21 seconds. Turn again. The precision was mesmerizing. The judge stood still, his umbrella forgotten in his hand. The clicking sound of the guard's heels echoed through the air like a heartbeat. No one in the small crowd spoke. Every person seemed to sense that they were in the presence of something sacred. When the guard turned and began his next pass, their eyes met briefly. The guard's face was young, serious, and calm, an image of focus and discipline. The judge felt an unexpected sting of emotion. He thought of Michael standing here years ago, doing the same thing with the same purpose. He stayed there for nearly an hour, watching in silence. The rhythm never changed. Rain fell softly on the marble, but the guard didn't flinch. Each step was a promise, one that said the fallen would never be forgotten. When the changing of the guard ceremony began, the judge watched closely. The precision, the crisp movements, the exchange of the rifle, it was like a dance of respect. Every motion carried meaning. When the ceremony ended, the judge stood there long after the crowd left, unable to move. Finally, he took out his phone and searched for a number. He called the courthouse records office. "I need contact information for a Mr. Michael Harris," he said. "It's a personal matter." Later that evening, Michael's phone rang. He was sitting by his living room window, reading an old military journal when he saw the unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a second before answering. "Mr. Harris?" came the familiar voice. "Yes, speaking," Michael replied. "This is Judge Patterson," the voice said softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Michael's tone remained calm. "No, sir. What can I do for you?" The judge took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Harris, a real one. The words I spoke in that courtroom were wrong. I didn't understand the meaning behind your service then, but I do now." There was a short silence on the line. Michael finally replied, "You don't need to apologize, Your Honor. We all learn in different ways." The judge hesitated. "Still, I want to make it right. I went to Arlington today. I watched the ceremony. It was humbling." Michael smiled faintly. "It always is." "I stood there," the judge continued, "and for the first time I felt what you meant when you said, 'We guard honor.' It's not just about soldiers, it's about respect for sacrifice." Michael didn't interrupt. He listened quietly, appreciating the sincerity in the man's voice. "I wanted to thank you," the judge said. "You didn't shout at me, you didn't argue, you simply spoke truth. And it changed how I see things." Michael replied gently, "Sometimes silence can teach louder than words." The judge nodded. even though the other man couldn't see him. "You're right. It taught me more than any book ever could." They spoke for a while, sharing stories. The judge confessed that before meeting Michael, he had seen veterans as just another group of people coming through his court, people with cases, problems, or pride. But now he understood the deeper story behind those uniforms. Michael, in turn, shared a few memories from his service, not of battle, but of nights standing in the cold rain, when every sound felt like a whisper from the past. "We don't think about ourselves in those moments," he said softly. "We think about the men who never came home." When their call ended, both men felt lighter. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, grateful for the second chance to show respect. The next morning, the judge returned to his courtroom with a new sense of humility. Before the session began, he asked everyone to stand for a moment of silence. The lawyers and clerks looked puzzled but obeyed. He said quietly, "Today I want to begin with respect for those who serve and for the values we sometimes take for granted." It was a simple gesture but a powerful one. Word spread quickly around the courthouse. People noticed the change in him, not just in his words, but in his tone, his patience, and the way he spoke to those before him. Meanwhile, Michael continued his quiet life. But soon he began receiving letters, first from local veterans, then from people across the country who had heard about the courtroom story through newspapers and online articles. One letter came from a high school teacher who wrote, "Your calm response taught my students more about honor than any lesson I could give." Another came from a young soldier who said, "Sir, because of your story, I've learned what it truly means to serve with respect." Michael didn't reply to every letter, but he read each one with gratitude. He wasn't looking for fame or praise. What mattered to him was that people were remembering the meaning behind the uniform, the silent respect, the duty, the promise never to forget one day. As he walked again through Arlington, a small group of visitors recognized him from a local article. They approached shyly. "Sir, are you the veteran from the courtroom story?" a young man asked. Michael nodded, smiling gently. "Yes, that's me." The man shook his hand. "Thank you. My brother served overseas. It means a lot to know people like you stand for them." Michael's smile softened. "We all stand for someone," he said quietly. "That's what makes the world better." As the visitors walked away, Michael looked once more toward the tomb. The guard was there again, walking the familiar 21 steps. The same steady rhythm, the same perfect movements. He stood there for a long time, watching the young soldier continue the duty he had once carried himself. The guard turned sharply and faced the crowd, his eyes forward, his stance unbroken. Michael whispered softly under his breath, "Keep guarding, son. The world still needs reminders of honor." And somewhere in a quiet courthouse downtown, Judge Patterson sat in his chambers, writing a short note of thanks addressed to Michael Harris. It simply read, "You reminded me what respect truly means. Some lessons are learned not from books, but from the strength of silent men." He folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and smiled. Weeks passed after the conversation between Michael Harris and Judge Patterson. The courtroom still carried the quiet memory of the day they had met, and for the judge, that memory had grown stronger over time. He began noticing things he had never paid attention to before, the way veterans carried themselves, the small details in their uniforms, and the silent pride in their voices. One morning, Judge Patterson decided to act. He stood before the courthouse at the start of the day and quietly told his clerks that he wanted to hold a small ceremony of respect for veterans who had served their country. At first, they were surprised. The judge had never done something like this before, but his tone was certain and they followed his request without question. When the court session began, the judge asked everyone, lawyers, clerks, visitors, to stand for a moment of silence. Then he spoke softly, without judgment or pride. "We often speak of respect, but we do not always live it. Today, I want us to remember what it truly means to serve." There was a quiet that fell over the courtroom, deep and real. It was the kind of silence that comes when people suddenly realize they have been given something unexpected, a lesson in humility. The story of the judge's gesture quickly spread beyond the courthouse. Local newspapers ran articles about the unusual moment, and soon social media began to carry the story. Comments came in from people across the country, veterans, students, teachers, and ordinary citizens, praising the change of heart. Michael heard about it too. At first he thought nothing of it. He did not seek recognition for his stand. But one evening a letter arrived for him at his home. It was from Judge Patterson. The envelope was simple, but the words inside were heavy with meaning. The letter read, "Mr. Harris, I owe you more than words. You reminded me of a truth I had forgotten, that respect is not given by title but by action. I am arranging a visit to Arlington National Cemetery, and I wish to see the tomb of the unknown soldier once more. I hope to learn more. Thank you." Michael folded the letter carefully. He knew the judge meant it sincerely, and so a date was set. The day of the visit arrived. The judge stepped out of his car quietly, dressed in a simple suit. This was not about ceremony. It was about learning. Michael met him at the cemetery entrance, wearing his old tomb guard uniform jacket. Though years had passed since his service, his posture was still perfect. They walked together toward the tomb, speaking little at first. The air was cool, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed softly. Michael led the judge through the grounds, pointing out the rows of white headstones that stretched far into the distance. "This is where they rest," Michael said quietly. "Men and women who gave everything for their country. Many have names, but some remain unknown. That is why we guard them." Judge Patterson nodded. He looked down at the ground, then back up at the tomb. A group of visitors stood nearby, watching the changing of the guard ceremony. The precision and silence of the guard seemed to speak louder than words. Michael turned to the judge. "When you watch them, you see discipline. But discipline is not enough. There is honor behind it." The judge looked at him closely. "And where does that honor come from?" Michael smiled softly. "From sacrifice. From understanding that your duty is greater than yourself." They stood quietly for a while. The guard at the tomb marched in perfect rhythm, the sound of footsteps echoing in the quiet air. The judge felt the weight of every movement. For him, it was more than tradition. It was a lesson in humility he had never expected to learn. After the ceremony, they walked toward a nearby bench. Michael spoke about his years as a tomb guard, not about fame or recognition, but about what it meant to stand silently for hours, guarding a tomb in weather that tested every human limit. He told the judge about the rules they lived by, the careful attention to every detail, the respect for the uniform, and the deep commitment to their duty. "We stand not for ourselves," he said softly, "but for the memory of those who cannot stand for themselves anymore." The judge listened carefully. His earlier arrogance seemed gone. There was a humility in his voice now when he spoke. "I see that now. I never understood before what it truly meant to guard a tomb. It is not guarding stones, it is guarding a promise." Michael nodded. "Exactly. That promise is what keeps us walking even when the world does not notice." For a while they said nothing. They simply sat in silence, watching the guard's slow, steady steps. The ceremony was over, but the meaning of it stayed with them. That evening the judge returned to his chambers with a new sense of purpose. He began writing a statement, one he wanted to read publicly in court. He wanted to make sure the lesson he had learned would not fade with time. The statement was simple yet powerful. "We must remember that respect is not a word. It is an action. It is shown through silence, through discipline, and through honoring the sacrifices of those who came before us. I will no longer forget this lesson." The next morning, before court began, the judge read his statement aloud. Every person in the room listened quietly. It was not a long speech, but it left a deep impression. Lawyers, clerks, and visitors sat with bowed heads, as if carrying a shared understanding of something important. Outside the courthouse, reporters began asking about the statement. Judge Patterson spoke briefly about what he had learned, and how one man's quiet dignity had changed him. The story spread quickly. Across the city, people began to speak of honor and respect in a new way. Meanwhile, Michael continued his quiet life, unaware of how far the judge's words had traveled. Yet he heard from friends, family, and strangers who told him about the judge's statement. Veterans wrote to him saying they felt seen and respected. Teachers told him they used the story in their classrooms to teach students about service and sacrifice. One afternoon, Michael received a phone call. It was the judge. "Mr. Harris," he said softly, "I want to invite you to speak to a group of young cadets. They need to hear your story." Michael hesitated for a moment. He was not used to speaking in public. But something in the judge's voice gave him courage. "I will," he replied quietly. That invitation marked a turning point. Michael agreed to speak not just to cadets but at schools, community gatherings, and veterans events. His quiet words began to inspire many people, and the courtroom incident became more than a moment. It became a lesson shared across communities. The judge, too, began to change. He invited veterans into his courtroom to speak about their service. He made a small but meaningful rule. Before every session, there would be a moment of silence to honor those who had served. It was a tradition born from respect, a tradition Michael had inspired without even trying. One afternoon, Michael returned to the cemetery. As he walked quietly toward the tomb of the unknown soldier, he saw the judge already standing there watching the ceremony. The judge turned when he saw Michael and nodded respectfully. No words were spoken between them. They didn't need to. The silence carried more meaning than any speech could. Michael stood beside him for a long time. They watched together as the guard walked in perfect rhythm, 21 steps, a pause, a turn. It was more than a ceremony. It was a promise that honor would never be forgotten. And for both men in that quiet moment, they understood something powerful. That respect is not just something we speak about, but something we live. The weeks after Judge Patterson's visit to Arlington were filled with quiet change. The story of the tomb guard and the judge had spread farther than either man expected. Veterans, students, teachers, and ordinary citizens began talking about the lesson in respect. Social media carried the story across the country. Some said it was a lesson in humility. Others called it a moment of truth. But for Michael Harris and Judge Patterson, it was simply a reminder that respect could transform hearts. One morning, Michael received another call from the judge. His voice was steady but carried a note of seriousness. "Mr. Harris, I have spoken to the local Veterans Council. They want you to speak at a special ceremony for Veterans Day. They feel your words could inspire others." Michael was quiet for a moment. He had never sought attention for what he did. But he felt the invitation was not for him. It was for something bigger. "I will do it," he said softly. On Veterans Day, a crisp autumn morning brought hundreds of people to Arlington National Cemetery. Flags waved in the gentle wind, and the air carried the smell of fresh flowers placed at the headstones. Veterans in neat uniforms stood together, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes. Families gathered in respectful silence. Michael was asked to speak after the changing of the guard ceremony. When he walked to the podium, the crowd went silent. He stood tall, his shoulders straight and his eyes calm. He did not speak loudly, but every word he said was clear, steady, and filled with meaning. "My friends," he began, "I am not here to speak about myself. I am here to speak about the men and women whose names we do not know, those who gave everything so that we might live in freedom." He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then he continued, "The tomb of the unknown soldier is not just a monument of stone. It is a promise that we will never forget. My duty as a guard was not to stand in front of a grave. It was to stand for honor, respect, and memory. That is something we all can do every day in our own way." The crowd listened in deep silence. Veterans wiped their eyes quietly. Families held hands. Even the judge, standing near the front row, nodded in respect. Michael closed his speech with a simple statement. Respect is not given by words alone. It is shown by actions. Guard your own honor. Guard the honor of others. That is the promise we carry forward. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for Michael, but for what his words represented. There were tears in the eyes of many, and a quiet pride in the hearts of all. Later that afternoon, Michael and Judge Patterson stood quietly together by the tomb. The ceremony had ended, but neither of them moved. The judge looked at Michael and said softly, "I owe you more than I can express. You have changed how I see everything, my service, my job, even myself." Michael nodded. "I didn't do anything special, sir. I simply spoke truth." "You spoke truth with dignity," the judge replied, "and that is a rare thing." They stood in silence again, listening to the soft rustle of flags in the wind. Around them, visitors walked slowly, some stopping to bow their heads. There was a sense of something greater in the air, a shared understanding of sacrifice, respect, and duty. The judge reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Michael. "This is a small thing," he said, "but I want you to have it." Michael unfolded it. It was a copy of the judge's public statement he had made in court weeks earlier. At the bottom in the judge's handwriting were the words, "To Michael Harris, thank you for reminding me what respect truly means. Your service is a lesson to us all." Michael looked up, his eyes soft. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means more than you know." The judge smiled faintly. "No, the honor is mine." In the weeks that followed, the story of Michael Harris and Judge Patterson continued to spread. Local news covered the Veterans Day speech. Teachers began including the story in their lessons on respect, service, and humility. Veterans wrote letters of thanks. Young soldiers sent messages saying they felt inspired to serve with deeper purpose. For Michael, it was never about recognition, but he felt grateful that people were remembering the meaning of his duty. He knew the story had become more than just an encounter in a courtroom. It had become a lesson shared across the nation. One afternoon, as Michael walked through Arlington Cemetery, he saw the judge again. They exchanged a quiet nod. The judge had brought a small group of law students to observe the changing of the guard. Michael watched from a distance as they stood respectfully. Later, the judge approached him. "I've told them your story," he said. "I want them to understand that justice is not only about laws, it is about respect for people and respect for truth." Michael smiled quietly. "Then your lesson is being passed on." For the judge, the moment was powerful. He had started as a man who mocked a guard for standing silently. But now he was a man who understood that silence could carry the deepest meaning. As the sun began to set, they stood together, looking at the tomb. The guard continued his steady march. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Every movement was a reminder of sacrifice and duty. Michael spoke softly. "We stand so they are never forgotten." The judge nodded. "And we remember because of men like you." They stayed in silence for a long time. No words were needed. The lesson had already been learned. In the years that followed, the story became part of the history of that small courtroom in Washington, D.C. Judge Patterson introduced the moment in speeches, telling young lawyers and judges about the day he learned what respect truly meant. Michael Harris continued to speak at schools, veteran events, and small gatherings. His quiet words continued to inspire. The ceremony at Arlington became more meaningful for those who attended. Visitors often remembered the story, and families brought their children to see the guard walk with perfect discipline. They spoke about Michael Harris and the judge who learned to stand quietly in respect. One day, years later, a young soldier asked Michael, "Sir, why did you speak so calmly in court that day? Why not argue back?" Michael looked at him with a gentle smile. "Because respect is not proved by raising your voice. It is proved by living it. That is the greatest honor we can give." The young soldier nodded quietly, understanding. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a quiet courtroom, Judge Patterson still paused before starting sessions. He would look up and remember the lesson a tomb guard had taught him. That respect is not just spoken but lived. Quietly, with dignity and without applause, the memory stayed with him forever. Because respect is not given, it is earned, and it begins with silence.